I think we'd all love for Anne Boleyn to have been given the chance to get her revenge on King Henry VIII, which is why I was really excited to read The Beheading Game, the delightfully bonkers new piece of historical fiction in which Anne Boleyn wakes up in that famous arrow chest, her head resting at her waist. What follows is a journey in which Anne manages to reattach her head before going out on a journey of both self-discovery and, of course, some cold, hard revenge. To discuss the story with me, I am pleased to welcome the book's author, Rebecca Leeman, onto the podcast for the first time. Join Rebecca and I as we discuss how she developed her ideas, the creative choices she made for Anne, what ancient legends inspired the story, plus much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 133, The Beheading Game, author interview with Rebecca Leeman. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Rebecca Leeman. How are you?
I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me, Adam.
You're very welcome. You're here to talk about your utterly brilliant, batshit bonkers book, The Beheading Game, that came out a few weeks ago. I listened to it on Audible. I absolutely adored it. Before we get into that discussion, there are a few questions, as it's your first time on the podcast, to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background? So where you grew up and what it is that you do full time?
Yeah, so I am from the United States. I grew up in one of the Midwestern states, Wisconsin, which is right on the Canadian border, right on the Great Lakes. I grew up right on Lake Michigan. And I currently work as an English professor at a little college in Indiana called St. Mary's College. And prior to writing The Beheading Game, I was a poet. So I've written and published 3 books of poetry, and this is my debut novel.
Given that we're talking about The Beheading Game, a couple of questions around Anne Boleyn. If you had the ability to jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from Anne Boleyn's life, what would you choose?
Yeah, I thought about this one quite a bit after you sent me the question earlier, and I think I would go way back. I would really love to go see her time with the Archduchess Margaret when she was staying with her as a young girl, 11 or 12 years old in the Low Countries. I think it would be really fascinating to see Anne as a child.
And by extension of that, if you had the chance to ask her a single question, what would you ask?
Yeah, what would I ask her if I could ask her a single question? You know, I think I would ask her if she really loved Henry, because that was a question that I had to make a decision about as an author in The Beheading Game, and I went with yes. But I don't know that it's completely clear in history if she felt um, as passionate toward him as he felt toward her, or if she was like all of Henry VIII's wives, kind of just pressured into saying yes.
Yeah, it's such a big question when we think about their relationship. You know, one of the most famous royal marriages in history, and we still don't really know. I mean, I'm inclined to believe that she did love him.
I am too, and that's the track I took in the novel. But you know, for example, like we have his love letters to her, but we don't have her love letters back because they were destroyed. So we can't really like get a full glimpse in there.
I mean, controversially, kind of the belief that she was the love of his life, I think.
Yeah.
And a lot of people struggle with that. I've always, it sounds a bit silly, but I've often likened them to the Tudor Burton and Taylor, like that kind of can't live with, can't live without, that was only ever going to implode. But I think...
Yeah, not a very healthy love, but a very passionate love. But I agree.
A very passionate one, undoubtedly. So, as I said, we're here to talk about The Beheading Game, which is a book that you wrote, came out a few weeks ago. Introduce The Beheading Game for me. What is the story here?
Okay, so The Beheading Game picks up in the hours after Anne Boleyn's execution. She wakes up in the arrow chest that she was buried in the Tower of London, beheaded but somehow still alive. She escapes from the Tower of London with her head under her arm, takes a boat, steals a boat, and takes it across the River Thames, ends up in Suffolk, steals a tavern keeper's wife's sewing basket, sews her head back on, and then goes on a quest to kill Henry VIII before he can marry his next wife, Jane Seymour. So in real life, Henry marries Jane just 11 days after Anne's execution. And if you didn't already believe that the charges against Anne were false, like many people today do, I think that's a very damning piece of evidence that he has the next wife waiting in the wings and doesn't even wait 2 weeks to marry her. So the novel has a very compressed timeline because of that. Of course, Anne can't know that it's going to be exactly 11 days, but she thinks it will be soon. And she wants to get to Henry before he marries Jane so that she can prevent him from having any more children to secure her daughter Elizabeth's ascension to the throne.
Well, as I said in the opening comments, it's a pretty batshit bonkers story, but I love it. I'm one of those people that the sort of the more bonkers historical fiction is, the easier time I actually have with it.
Oh wow, yeah.
There's, you're under no, you're not deluded in the sense that you think this is possible. It's like what I loved, My Lady Jane. I don't know whether you watched or read the book.
Oh, beautiful. I did not get around to reading the book. I did watch the TV series and I really enjoyed it. It was so fun.
I loved it. I thought it was so much fun because it wasn't pretending to be anything other than bonkers, but brilliant. And so things like The Beheading Game, like My Lady Jane, I actually find much easier to enjoy than straight up historical fiction, weirdly.
Yeah.
And to that end, how did you come up with this idea?
Well, I really wanted to find a way to rewrite the story of Anne Boleyn. I had been fascinated with her for many years. As I mentioned, I was a poet before I wrote this novel, and she would keep popping up in my poems, kind of on the periphery, like she was never center stage. But I had always found her a very fascinating figure. And at the start of the COVID pandemic during lockdown, I read Hilary Mantel's beautiful Wolf Hall books, and that only kindled that flame more. So I thought a lot about how I could retell her story and show her in a more complex and three-dimensional light because she's often really simplistically cast as this sort of like oversexed homewrecker that breaks up Henry VIII's first marriage and then gets what she deserves when she's ultimately beheaded. But there's so much more to her, and it doesn't take a lot of research to discover that the charges against her were probably false and that she was this incredibly intelligent, passionate, politically savvy woman, a religious reformer, just had all of these really interesting things going on. So I thought a lot about how I could get into the story and retell it. And I thought of things like, well, I could have her escape before the beheading, or I could have her marry her cousin James Butler and move to Ireland, or I could reset the story forward in time. But ultimately, I really wanted to keep the beheading in the novel because I feel like it's the thing from Anne Boleyn's story that really resonates across 500 years of history because it's this example of a woman achieving a lot of power and then being punished for that power. And I think that that's a story that unfortunately resonates into today. Of course, women aren't still being beheaded for being powerful, but I do think that you still see that pattern now where women ascend to a certain level of power. And then if something goes wrong in the company they work for or whatever, they're the ones that take the fall and have these really steep, precipitous descents. So I thought, okay, if I want to keep the beheading in, how am I going to do this? And then one day when I was at work and just filling my water bottle up at the water fountain, I just thought, like, well, what if she just wakes up? And there's a long tradition of what are called head carrier stories. One that is referenced in the Beheading Game is the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from Arthurian legend, where the Green Knight is this magical being that survives his beheading and picks up his head. But in North America, we have the story of the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman, who is beheaded and has a pumpkin instead of a head that he carries around. And then, of course, there's the cephalophore saint stories like Saint Denis, where people are beheaded and just keep going. And I thought, why not Anne? Why couldn't she have that story? So once I got that idea in my head, I just could not stop thinking about it. And I sat down and wrote the first chapter of The Beheading Game.
Amazing. And once you developed the central idea, did you then have to spend quite a bit of time actually in research? Because as much as, yes, this is historical fiction, you still need to ground it in what happened to Anne, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly because I was taking this really big imaginative leap. Like I know, as you said, the novel has this kind of like batshit bizarre premise of what if she came back to life. But I also really wanted it to be a serious look at this woman who I'm really fascinated with. And so because of that, because of the fantastical element, I wanted the historical elements to be as accurate as I could make them. So yeah, I spent a lot of time researching because I wanted to get the Tudor dynasty correct. And as an American, I hadn't had a great education in the history of like British monarchs through time. So I just needed to do like some basic who is whose cousin and who is whose father and who gave birth to whom and dive in that aspect. But then I also wanted to get the little details of everyday life correct. And in particular, like what life would have been like for commoners in London and in Tudor England.
Yeah, your world building is excellent. I mean, it really is. You definitely get a real sense between the different classes, the different people in society at the time. And given that something I'm quite interested to hear is, given that you're dealing with a topic which is ostensibly impossible, did you also then have to set yourself parameters on where the story wouldn't go, where the magic, for want of a better term, couldn't reach? When I was thinking about this, I remember watching something, and J.K. Rowling mentioned that she'd put really clear parameters in place when writing Harry Potter about where magic couldn't go, what she couldn't do. Were there aspects of that you did you set yourself parameters as such?
I did. Yeah, that was something I thought about quite a bit. And you mentioned like My Lady Jane earlier, which is a book that has like goes full in on the fantasy. That can be really fun, but that's not the book that I was writing here. So I wanted this to be a book that maybe fell more in the camp of magical realism, where most of the things in the novel are real and true, but there's this one very strange thing that happens, which is Anne coming back from the dead and being able to reanimate and being able to put her head back on her body and have that work and keep going. There are a couple other very well, there's a couple smaller things that seem magical-ish as the novel goes on, and I don't know that it's ever completely clear whether those are magic or whether they're just really great coincidences. But then at the ending of the book, there's another magical element that comes in. But I tried to keep these just to Anne. So, like things that could happen to her, but not things that she could necessarily invoke. So, there's no point in the novel, for example, where the magic of how she comes back to life gets explained to her. There's not like a moment where the lady in the lake shows up and is like, this is what's happening. Here's how it works. There's nothing like that. She's really, really puzzled and perplexed and thrown by coming back to life and thinks about it a lot in the book. Like, why has this happened? The best referent that she has for this kind of story is stories of resurrection in her own religious faith. And so she kind of thinks of this as like maybe this is an act of God that's happened. But I didn't want her to, for example, be able to like use magic to break into Whitehall Palace or something. I wanted her to have this magical thing happen to her, but then have to survive on her own wits. And I did think about that very deliberately as I was writing.
And you've already hinted at this a moment ago, but did you draw in any historical legends when shaping the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, the big one that I was thinking about was the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of my favorite stories from Arthurian legend, where this magical Green Knight shows up at King Arthur's court and says, if anybody can beat me at a fight, you can have my magical axe. I think it's an axe. And Gawain, the king's nephew, steps up very cocky, very young, and says, oh, I'll do it. And his big trick is, I'll just behead this Green Knight and then he'll be dead. And oh, the Green Knight also says, whatever you do to me, I get to do back to you in a year. And so Gawain thinks, well, I've got the perfect solution. I'll just behead this Green Knight and then he'll be dead and he won't be able to behead me back. But then the Green Knight picks up his head and is like, I'll see you in a year out of his head while he's carrying it. In that story, Gawain gallantly shows up and receive his beheading a year later. And then because he's been so chivalrous, the Green Knight just nicks him on the back of the neck and doesn't actually behead him. But I was thinking about that story a lot when I was writing The Beheading Game. That story is an example of a beheading game style story, which were a type of story in the British Isles that like even precede Arthurian legend, where there's always a magical being, an upstart young knight, a test of chivalry, this idea of like trading blows a year later. And I wanted to think about this as like a game that Anne is involved in. Like, is she a sort of Green Knight figure, and is she coming to give Henry his return blow? But I also was thinking about other Arthurian legends, like a version of Excalibur shows up in the Beheading Game. And I was just sort of thinking about like the magic of those types of stories and legends. There are additionally some like fairy tales that thread throughout the book. So there's a version of Mr. Fox, which is an Old English folktale version of Bluebeard. There's a version of the Grimm Brothers tale, The Golden Bird, that gets told at one point in the story. And then at the end of the book, without giving anything away, Anne has a moment to tell her own kind of fairy tale and reframe what has happened to her.
And the book does it sits within the world of historical fiction, but there's always with historical fiction there has to be some grounding in reality. So to that end, how did you balance the historical authenticity against creative storytelling?
Yeah, I found that to be, look, on the one hand, really fun. I enjoyed doing the research and diving into this time period, but also at times it was challenging because at times when I was writing, I was kind of researching simultaneous to writing the book. And so at times when I was writing, I had to stop a lot to find, like, as a person that's not an expert in this time period or wasn't before I wrote this book, like I didn't know what all the layers of clothing were called, for example. So, when Anne takes her gown off at the beginning of the novel because it's like a giveaway that she's the queen and she's trying to hide that fact, I then had to look up, okay, well, what would have been under it? Like I know there were a lot of layers that women wore. What is the thing called? And it's a kirtle. And what's under that? And that's a shift. And is there anything under that? And those types of questions were important to me, but they did take a lot of time. And there was some tension there as I was writing the book between getting all those little details like right versus having the plot move forward. There were times where, because I was really in the momentum of writing, I would just write and then put X's, like a line of X's, where I didn't know the word for something or didn't know what something was called, and then go back and backfill later to get those details correct. Places were also really important to me. So when I finished the first draft, I came to London and visited a lot of the places in the novel. And that was so helpful for getting details right, because obviously living in Indiana in the United States, I can't just like, take a bus to London and go see the Tower of London whenever I want. But it was so helpful to go see the places in person and get those details in.
Yeah, seeing them in the flesh makes such a difference. It really does.
Yeah,
I'm very
it
lucky
does.
they're on my doorstep, so I'm quite lucky.
Oh, that's so lovely. I had been to London a couple of times before, but it was before I started writing the novel, and so I wasn't paying attention to those kinds of details when I had previously visited some of those places.
So, an aspect of the Anne Boleyn that you write, that you create, is that she frequently says things without thinking
Yeah.
first, and that she can unwillingly insult people. I think that this rings possibly quite true of the real Anne Boleyn. Would you agree? Was that quite a deliberate character choice you made?
Y- Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's difficult to know exactly what Anne Boleyn was like because a lot of information about her was destroyed, a lot of her writing was destroyed. And then a lot of like what we have for historical information comes through this guy named Eustace Chapuis, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, who is like a terrible gossip, an ambassador to the court. He was working for Catherine of Aragon's nephew, I believe, and so he's really anti-Anne, and everything that he writes about her is framed through this extremely resentful and misogynistic lens. Like he just refers to her as the concubine and the great whore in his writings. But he wrote so many letters and kept such great records that I think that those are great places to go for like what happened when and what is a timeline. I think unfortunately sometimes historians look at his characterization of her and take it at face value when like it's just so biased. But I will say I think that while many of the ways that he characterized her were untrue, I do think that there's a lot of evidence that she was really, could be really pushy, could be a little bit of a bully, was probably a terrible snob, and would say things that were really insulting. She had a hot temper, and she was not afraid of speaking her mind. I think, I thought of her if she were living today. I mean, I can think of people that would probably be like that, but we probably all know someone who can't really like. There's no filter. Everything that they think comes right out of their mouth, and I think she probably suffered from that.
Yes, I would agree. I certainly don't think that she was a nasty person by any stretch of the
No.
imagination, but I think she could be quite her emotions were I don't think she was an immoderate person in any way, and her emotions
Right.
from what we can tell were always quite near the surface. But I totally agree with you as well that with Eustace Chapuis, I mean, I have to admit we'd be pretty lost without, but Eustace Chapuis and the
Absolutely.
Lisle letters, if both of those
Yeah,
sources were lost to us, then we'd know a lot less about Tudor history. I mean, yes, Chapuis is
absolutely.
delicious, really, because he's so gossipy.
I agree. I agree. Right. And when I was looking at that source and trying to like know Anne better, I got a little offended at the way he characterized her. But also, it's kind of fun to like. He's just such a gossip, and he can be so mean in his letters. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are several moments throughout the novel where Anne is either over, regularly overhears people being quite unkind about her, slandering her, mentioning the fact that she deserved her beheading and things like that. Was this a way of I suppose humbling Anne a bit, that the Anne that you create, that you added that in?
Well, one thing that I was interested in doing in the novel, in addition to like re-examining Anne and retelling her story, was I really wanted to place her in a situation where she would be out of place, where she would not be completely comfortable. So I drop her in a very bawdy neighborhood, a very bawdy part of London, in a place where she has to try to pass as a commoner, where nobody is going to know that she's queen, and so that respect is going to drop immediately. And outside of the palace walls, she's really, in the beheading game, she's really unsure of how to handle herself. She makes a lot of mistakes at the beginning and gets into some trouble. And I was so interested in just kind of like evolving her as a character from somebody who is absolutely convinced that she's in the right and that she's been victimized, which I think is true, but also to have her just kind of see outside of her own perspective into the experiences of the common people of London and England and into what they actually thought of her. I think, like a lot of political leaders, she was pretty oblivious to what the people that she was attempting to govern thought, and maybe even to what they wanted. I think that she had really great goals and aspirations, like, for example, to use the wealth from the dissolution of the monasteries to like build hospitals and universities. And she thought that these were things that would benefit people, that getting the Catholic Church under control and possibly dissolved would be a benefit to the common people. But I don't think that she ever like went out and did a focus group, for example, among commoners and asked like, is that even something you care about? And I think that people really resented that and didn't necessarily want somebody in the seat of power telling them that they had to change religions and what to do. And I wanted her to get a glimpse at that and have her understand what life was like for everybody else.
Yeah, and I suppose what drew you to wanting to tell this specific story about Anne Boleyn? Why Anne, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that she's just such a firecracker of a person. And I hate to pick a favorite among Henry VIII's wives because I think that all of these women were really fascinating and they all were done so wrong by Henry VIII. But I think that one of the reasons that I've always been drawn to her and that she continues to draw people's attention is that she's somebody who just was so outspoken in her life and in many ways didn't conform to gender standards of the time, that women should be meek and submissive and quiet. It's really telling that the next wife, Jane Seymour, has the moniker the Obedient, which is just the opposite of Anne Boleyn. And I think that that part of her personality, that although she was living in this extremely patriarchal time 500 years ago, she just could not be a submissive woman. She just couldn't do it. It wasn't in her nature. And that's something that I find so fascinating and heroic in her character. And I think that's part of what drew me to her.
Yeah, I mean, there's no. Whilst yes, I also struggle to. We shouldn't pit these women against each other and say who are our favourites. There is absolutely no doubt that Anne Boleyn is by far and away the most popular of the six queens. I mean,
She
that's
is very popular. Yeah.
she's easily the most popular, and we see that even things like have you seen Six?
I haven't seen it live. I have listened to the recording quite a bit, though.
Yeah, because the Anne Boleyn gets her own introduction where the queens say the one you've been waiting for, the one you've been waiting for. So
Yeah,
even in that, the other queens are kind of aware. We know why most people are in the room
right.
is to see Anne.
Yes, yeah, she has that star power.
You do invent a character, I suppose. You must have invented Alice, but there is a character, Alice, who becomes very central. She's a really compelling presence in the book. So, how did you develop her character and also her moral perspective, I suppose?
Yeah, so Alice was one of my favorite characters to write in this book. She's completely invented. Most of the characters in the book are based on historical figures, with a couple of exceptions, but Alice and the people that she associates with were totally made up. Early in the novel, Anne gets into a scrape in Southwark, and Alice, who is a part-time sex worker and is being released from the Clink prison after bribing the jailer, kind of like rescues Anne and gets her out of this scrape, brings her back to her brothel, gives her a place to sleep for the night, gives her some food, and then Anne tricks her into helping her, recognizing that Alice is this really savvy person who could aid her in moving through Southwark and London and help her complete her task and this vengeance quest that she's going on. She tricks Alice into helping her. She lies to her about who she is, and offers to pay her handsomely to accompany her and help her. Um, and initially, I was just going to have Alice be in the book for a short amount of time. And I kind of envisioned this as like a walking around novel where Anne would meet a lot of different people and change her perspective on the world around her. But Alice was such a compelling character. I just loved writing her, and I could not get her out of the book. Like I just wanted her to stay longer. And the two develop they're kind of like an enemies to friends sort of thing, or tension into friends, and then eventually that blossoms into more of a romance, a little baby romance as the book goes forward. um Alice is a character who is a commoner. She's a part-time sex worker. She's from the Fens in the north of England, which was an area that was really looked down on in this time period. And she brings a really strong, um, maybe like anti-nobility perspective to the situation. She's very clear with Anne that she thinks that wealthy people and privileged people and people of the upper class are loafers and are leeching off of the commoners. And I really wanted to bring that perspective in because I think sometimes there's a misconception that during this time period, common people were just like, okay, this is great. I love being, like on the bottom rung, when in fact there were like peasant revolts all the time, and people were not particularly pleased with this extremely rigid class system that was going on. And so I also love her as like a counter. Like Anne is a strong personality, but so is Alice, and she really matches Anne like beat for beat in terms of wit and having a sharp tongue.
And their relationship, however that develops, but it does become really the central relationship of the story. These two women from very, very different worlds. Based on what you've just said, then I'm assuming that this wasn't actually always intentional, but developed as you were writing the book.
Yeah, it did. Initially, this was just going to be a friendship, but the more I wrote it, the more it started to seem romantic, and the more it started to seem like kind of like a queer-coded friendship. And I thought about books and movies that I watched when I was a kid, read or watched when I was a kid in like the 80s and 90s, that were rather queer coded, but never went all the way there. So, for example, I used to just love the book Anne of Green Gables. I don't know if you've ever read it.
I haven't.
By
I know it, but I
Oh,
haven't read it.
yeah, it's a great book. I must have read it, I don't know, like 2 dozen times when I was in third and fourth grade. And in the book, Anne is like at the end, she ends up with this boy named Gilbert Blythe, but she has this best friend named Diana. And when I was a kid, I remember thinking it really seems like she's in love with Diana. And then I reread the book to my daughter, who's 7, recently. And even more so, I thought this is like a queer-coded friendship. But, for probably a variety of reasons, it doesn't end up that way in this book that was written over 100 years ago. And I thought as well about like the American movie A League of Their Own, where the characters are all playing softball and they seem pretty queer, but it doesn't ever go all the way there. And I didn't want to write a book that had this kind of like queer coded friendship that didn't go there. I mean, there were queer people now, there were queer people then. I wanted to get that perspective in. Like, not everything was as straight and narrow as we might imagine looking back at history. There were all kinds of encounters that were blurring the lines. So that was a very interesting development for me in the book. And then once I made the decision to go there with their friendship and have it blossom into a romance, it was even more fun to write.
And I mean, Alice is, it's not even hinted at. It's clear that she's bisexual, if not gay.
Yeah.
But your Anne Boleyn and her, they have this connection. Again, was that, I suppose, a way of keeping the story inherently female? Like, it's a story of female empowerment. Was that part of it? What was going on there with when you would write, when you came up with that as a part of the story, I
Oh,
guess?
yeah, that's a good question. Like, as opposed to having Anne meet another man on her journey and have like a heterosexual relationship, that didn't even cross my mind as
Right.
something to do, I'll be honest, because I just felt like she was so done with Henry. I think that, I wanted her to have this different experience. I really liked Alice as a character. I didn't maybe think about it in an extremely deliberate way as being something super unusual, because I think that bisexuality is like a pretty common thing. Like,
Totally, yeah.
maybe like a little, but it's very hard to see sometimes because, like, some bisexual people end up in straight relationships and then they're just read as straight. And I think that that was probably true back in Tudor times too, that people would, if they were bisexual and were attracted to both genders, were able to just like, put themselves in one direction and go on that path. But I think that for Anne and Alice, this is maybe not dependent on it being a queer relationship and two women, but I really wanted Anne to have a relationship that she came into as more of an equal. Alice doesn't know that she's the queen. She views her as a noble woman, but like somebody who doesn't really know what she's doing. And the two are coming to this romance on equal terms and equal footing. And I wanted Anne to see the possibility of a different type of relationship that could be more equal and that could be happier as a counter to this really tempestuous and passionate and toxic relationship that she's had with Henry, where he has had so much more power over her than she had over him. Although she kind of bewitches him when they're courting, ultimately he's a man in Tudor times. On top of that, he's the king, and then with her help, he also becomes head of the Church of England. So like he has power, 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 and it's this extremely unequal relationship. So I hope that in the novel, through this relationship with Alice, my hope was that Anne could just have this like alternative. Like, what if love could be like this? What if it could be more equal? What if it could be gentler? You know?
And which character surprised you the most as you were writing?
Um, I think that, well, Alice, because I initially envisioned her as just coming in and then she stayed longer. But I will say, I think that Mary Boleyn probably like was a character that I intended to thread in a little bit more in the novel, but it's kind of like kept out a little intentionally because she's been written about so much. And of course, there's this scandalous detail that Mary Boleyn was Henry VIII's mistress before he starts courting Anne Boleyn. She pops in a little bit, and I really thought about how to characterize her. And in the novel, without giving too much away, but she's there, she comes in and out, and she's just sort of this like scolding and aloof older sibling that's trying to tell Anne how to do things. I've thought a lot about sibling dynamics with that character, and just like, how older siblings often are doing things first, and then also just like very peripherally aware of their younger siblings. And if they're doing anything, maybe they're just scolding them on the side. I say that as an oldest sibling myself. I feel like I've often been just like my head in the clouds doing what I'm doing, and then my younger brothers are like, what? We're still here.
Loyalty and betrayal are key factors in both the real Anne Boleyn story and the Beheading Game. One of the things I really loved about the book is that you do pepper it with other characters that Anne knew well and that were part of Anne's story, such as Thomas Wyatt, William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower.
Yeah.
But you also bring Thomas Cromwell into the story, and you actually give his character Some redemption. So why did you go down that route with Cromwell?
Yeah, I thought so much about how to portray Cromwell in this story. Cromwell is such an interesting figure to me, especially in the context of Anne, because it seems like they should have been allies. They had so many things in common, their religious beliefs, some of their political philosophies. They both really love being right next door to power. But I think that they're so similar to each other that they ended up in real life kind of becoming enemies. Like they were seeking to have the same place in the life of the king as like top advisor, person that he's turning to for all of his advice. And so they end up pushing apart from each other in real life. But I also, when thinking about Cromwell, I thought about him as somebody who really liked power, and really wanted to be close to power. And I don't know, my project in this novel was not to write about Thomas Cromwell, but I also, like, I don't know that he necessarily believed in everything that he was doing. I think he just was infatuated with being right next to the seat of power. And so, although he does behave in really reprehensible ways in his life, I think he's doing so with the belief that he's helping the crown and he's helping the king. And I think that when Anne does encounter him, without giving too much away, he's interested in the power that she has now, and that she has this power is very attractive to him.
He's a fascinating figure, and I, as much as his hand is extremely instrumental in Anne's downfall, I've always felt that I think he probably had a huge amount of respect for her in his own way. I know that's difficult to compute, given that this is the man who orchestrates her death, but I think there would have been significant respect there in his own way.
I think this question fascinated me so much when I was researching, and this is something Anne thinks about in the novel as well. You know, like when she wakes up after her beheading, she really hates Cromwell and Henry. But then the more she thinks about it, and I think this is maybe like a misconception in history too, is that we think like, oh, Cromwell had this big hand in Anne's downfall. And as you pointed out, he did. But I think he was acting at the orders of the king. I don't think anybody was doing anything that Henry VIII didn't want. And that's a realization that Anne works toward in the beheading game as well. Like rather than imagining that Henry VIII, her husband, is this manipulatable figure, she's kind of starting to realize that he's the one pulling the strings, and these people who think that they're controlling him probably aren't and are being manipulated by him, just as she has been, Cromwell included.
And are there any modern parallels you hope the reader might pick up on with Beheading Game?
I mean, I think there were a couple of stories that I thought about quite a bit when I was writing The Beheading Game. I thought a little bit about how women are sometimes blamed for the shortcomings of the men around them. In Anne's case, she is. Obviously, this execution is like at the behest of her husband, Henry VIII, but she's also kind of like becoming this focal point for the anger of the nation around the displacement of Catherine of Aragon and the break from the Catholic Church. Like she's in an easy place to put that anger for everybody. And so I thought, and those weren't things that she was totally in control of, right? Like Henry VIII was doing those things. So I thought about stories like, um, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and how much Yoko Ono was blamed for quote unquote breaking up the Beatles, although of course, like she did no such thing, and she's this incredibly talented woman. But that line and that bad joke has persisted for so many decades after this like thing happened. I also thought a little bit about the way that Hillary Clinton was treated in the media in the United States, particularly after Bill Clinton's affairs in the 1990s, where like she hasn't done this bad behavior, but nonetheless, she sort of like comes under this big assault from the media for staying with him, for not leaving him, and what role could she have played? And even recently, when she was brought in for questioning, not to touch a third rail, but related to the Epstein files, like as though she has anything to do with the misbehavior of all of these men. She's not involved in that. And nonetheless, the focus of people's anger keeps drawing toward her. And I think that those are just two examples, but you can see example after example in contemporary culture of men behaving badly and women kind of taking the blame for them.
And so finally, this is a book that is crying out, I think, for an adaptation for the screen. Were that to happen, what elements do you think would you be most excited or maybe nervous to see brought to life?
I would be so excited to see how somebody would work with her head being detached. I think that would be really fun. And they can do so many neat things with special effects now to make like to make things look realistic and not strange. I had so she this isn't really much of a spoiler, but she gets her head back on pretty fast in the novel by like the third chapter, I think. And that was like I knew that that was going to happen. I intended her to put her head back on, but also when I got to that point in writing the novel, I was so relieved because it was really difficult to write a character whose head is in her hands. Every time she turns, she has to like turn her whole body. Every time she wants to look at something, she has to move the head up and down. It's like a whole thing. And even though I was writing the novel, I was really paranoid that she was going to drop her head in the river or something, and the head is really heavy. Like I was in total control, but I was still nervous. So I think it would be really fun if this book ever does get a film adaptation to see how the filmmakers would handle having her head off at the very beginning. And I also think it would be fun to see what they do at the ending of the novel without giving anything away.
Yes, very much. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. This has been really fun. I mean, it's a brilliant book. So, folks, if you haven't
Thank you.
read The Beheading Game yet, or I listened to it on Audible, it's absolutely brilliant. So, what's next, Rebecca? Is Catherine Howard gonna have her head sewn back on, or?
Oh, she's such a fascinating figure, right? I think she's the wife I feel the second most bad for. She gets such a raw shake. No, I don't have any more Tudor novels planned at the moment. I did just finish the first draft of a second novel right before Christmas, but it's still so new I'm not ready to talk about it. It does not in the Tudor world though, but there is a little. Anne Boleyn makes a very, very small appearance as a figure that is being studied in the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago about Margaret Pole, who you might
Oh,
know
yeah.
was had a badly botched beheading. So
Yes.
I would love if you ever feel like doing a one around her, I'd be all up for it.
I will keep that in mind and come to you for resources if I do.
Brilliant. Are you across social media at all? If people want to follow you and keep up to date with what you do.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Rebecca Leeman, author.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast, and perhaps we'll speak again at some point in the future.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been a delight.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Rebecca Leeman for coming onto the podcast to discuss The Beheading Game with me. Next week, I'm pleased to be welcoming another new guest onto the podcast as I chat to historian Richard Wolfe about the life of one of Queen Elizabeth I's most prominent counsellors, Sir Robert Cecil, the diminutive chap that she rather condescendingly called her pygmy. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, future podcast guests, please do drop me a message either on Instagram, or if you're a subscriber to the channel, you can message me on Patreon. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.